I'm John, founder of DigitalBlind.com. I want to share with you the process I use to create the high dynamic range photos that you see on my website. High dynamic range is a process in which 3 images are taken at different exposure settings and then digitally combined to create a single image that more accurately reflects the range of luminance the human eye can perceive. To explain this process, I'll go to a location and take 3 images. I'll then talk about what equipment you need and what settings to use on your camera. Then I'll go to the computer and use Photomatics to digitally combine those 3 images into our high dynamic range photo. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to reading your comments in the section below. So behind me, you can see a bulldozer. I've got my camera set up here. But what you probably can't see is the beautiful sunset that is up in the sky. And the reason that is because the video camera I'm using to record this doesn't capture that same high dynamic range. So I'm going to use my camera with my tripod and my wired shutter release to take 3 pictures. And then those 3 pictures are what we'll use to digitally combine to create the high dynamic range image that you see. And I'm actually going to go over to the camera and I'm going to focus on the sky. And now I'm probably all dark and you can only see the sky, but you can see more of this beautiful sky. And really that demonstrates the high dynamic range that we're trying to capture. Both the brightness of the sky and then also the dark areas here where I am with this bulldozer and everything. Here I've got my Nikon D90 with an Acor 18-200mm lens mounted on it. I'm going to talk about the settings I use when I'm taking HDR pictures. The principles I talk about apply for any brand or model of camera, but the controls will be in different places. So the most important feature that your camera needs to have is auto bracketing. And this allows you to take 3 pictures with different exposure settings without having to go back and change the settings between shots. So to turn on auto bracketing on the D90, I would press and hold this BKT button here, and then turn this right dial to the right until it says 3F and 2.0. What this means is it'll take 3 frames, and the first frame will be underexposed. It'll be darker by 2 stops, or 2 exposure values. The second photo will be at normal exposure, and then the third will be overexposed, again by 2 stops. It'll be lighter. So these are the 3 photos that will digitally combine to create the high dynamic range image. The second setting is that I shoot in aperture priority mode, indicated by this A here on the left dial. And what this does, it allows me to choose the aperture, the size of the opening of the lens, and then the camera will automatically calculate the shutter speed. Aperture priority mode is important because if you have different apertures for your 3 different images, the depth of field will be different. How much of the image for each of the 3 is in focus will be different. So you want the aperture to be the same for each of the 3 photos, and aperture priority mode allows you to do that. I shoot at a low ISO. On the D90, I'd press and hold this ISO button here. I shoot at ISO 200, and also you can go down to ISO 100, indicated by this L1.0 here. And the lower the ISO, the less noise and the higher quality the image will be. And lastly, I will shoot in RAW. This gives a little bit more flexibility in the post-processing, and also if you're just taking a single image like of a moving object, then you can tone map just the one image to create a pseudo HDR. It won't have the same dynamic range as when you take 3 images at different exposures, but it still allows you to take advantage of some of the post-processing HDR techniques. So these are the settings that I use when I'm taking HDR photos. I have the 3 images that I took loaded onto my computer, and I've got Photomatics Pro open. I am on a Mac. If you're using a Windows computer, the Photomatics settings on the Windows version are virtually identical. To get started, I'll click on Load Bracketed Photos, and then Browse. You can load the 3 photos one at a time, but I just click on the first one, hold down the Shift key, and then click on the third to select all 3 at once, and then load. Bit of a shortcut. Once I've got those 3 images, I'll click on OK, and I'll get some pre-processing options. The first one is Align Source Images. I take a lot of effort to make sure the camera doesn't move. I use a tripod and a wired shutter release But if it's windy or for whatever reason the camera does move, this will make sure those three images line up exactly. So I'll align source images by matching features and then crop the aligned images. Below that is an option called Reduce Ghosting Artifacts. If you're taking a picture of, say, a street and a car goes by, or people are walking around, or if you're taking a picture of a lake and there are waves, anytime there's movement in the picture, because the wave or the person or the car is not going to be in the same place in each of the three pictures, you'll get this ghosting effect. Now in some cases, like if it's a car going by in a street, I think that looks cool. You get a sense of movement as the car is streaking along. But in other cases, if it's waves or people, it doesn't look very good. But I won't actually use the Reduce Ghosting Artifacts setting here. If I do want to remove that ghosting, I'll use Photoshop, so I don't use that setting. Reduce noise. If the image looks grainy, which sometimes happens if you're taking a picture of a scene at night, or if there's lower light, you can introduce some noise. You can use reduce noise to smooth those out to make it look better. Again, if there is noise in my picture, I'll use a plugin to reduce that noise. I won't use this option here. Chromatic aberrations. These occur when the lens doesn't focus the light in different colors to a single point. It'll actually split the light, so you'll get this fringing in maybe purple or red along areas of high contrast in an image. And the HDR process can sort of exacerbate the chromatic aberrations in your three pictures. So I will click on that to reduce those colored fringings, those chromatic aberrations. Below that, white balance, I'll just do as shot to use the settings on my camera. Whatever white balance settings on my camera will be applied. And then color primaries, I'll just do Adobe RGB. My camera's set to Adobe RGB, so it makes sense to have those two match. So those are my pre-processing options. I'll go ahead and click pre-process, and here is our preliminary HDR photo. And it already looks pretty good, but I think we can tweak it and make it look even better. On the bottom there are a number of presets. So there's a black and white preset, there's an enhancer smooth, enhancer grunge, and so they serve as starting points where some of the settings have been selected for you. But I usually start with the enhancer painterly, and then on the right side there are a number of sliders that you can further tweak the image. So let's go ahead and do that. So I've started on enhancer painterly, and the top slider is strength, and this controls how powerful the HDR effect looks. If I turn all the way down, it'll look more like a regular photo and you'll have less of that dynamic range. The sky is a little more blown out, a little too bright. You don't get as much detail and color variance down here on the bulldozer itself. So most of the time I'll actually leave this up at 100. Below that is color saturation. If I turn this all the way down, there'll be no color. You'll get a grayscale image. And if you turn all the way up, the colors will be very vibrant and very bright. Now a lot of time if I turn color saturation all the way up, the photo looks too punchy, the colors are too unrealistic, and it doesn't look good. But in this case I actually like the color saturation at 100. It is important to keep in mind that the settings I use on this particular photo are going to be different than what I use on another photo, and it depends on the lighting conditions of the images you took and what effect you want to go for. So keep in mind that these are guidelines. This is what I think looks good for this photo, but it's going to be different for other photos depending on your preferences and the lighting characteristics of your shot. So below color saturation is luminosity, and this controls how bright or how dark the image is. I've turned it all the way down. You can see the image is darker, and there's also this halo effect where the bulldozer breaks the horizon line and goes up into the sky. And sometimes even if you don't turn luminosity all the way down, you'll get this halo effect. So one trick to help alleviate that halo, that fringe, is to turn luminosity all the way up or turn it up higher. And you can see that halo is really gone away. So for this image, I'm actually going to turn luminosity all the way up. Below that is micro contrast. Micro contrast makes the image more sharp if you turn it up. It also makes the image a little bit darker if you turn it up. And if you turn it down, there's less micro contrast and the image is a little bit lighter. So for this one, I think I like it a little bit around 3 or so. That looks pretty good for micro contrast. Below that is smoothing. There's a light mode, and then there's a mode where it's just a slider. In the light mode, if you turn it on minimum smoothing, it'll look pretty grungy, pretty psychedelic. Does not look good in my opinion. If you turn it up to max, it will be a little washed out. Also, I don't think looks that good. I generally don't use the light mode. Similar principles, if I turn the smoothing down, it'll look a little more splotchy, a little more patchy. If you turn it all the way up, it'll be a little more washed out. So you really want a happy medium, depending on the photo. For this one, I think around 4 will look pretty good. Below that is white point, and this relates to color balance and also the brightness or darkness of the image. If I turn the white point up, the brighter areas will be more white. If I turn it down, the image will get darker. For this one, I'm going to put it up around 4.5. I think that'll look pretty good. Black point is similar, but it's really the inverse. If I turn the black point down, the image will get brighter. If I turn the black point all the way up, the darker areas will be more black and the image will get darker. For this one, I don't like the black point very high for this particular image. Below black point is gamma. And again, this relates to how bright or how dark the image looks, but it works a little bit differently than luminosity. If I turn gamma to the left, image looks a little bit darker, but the algorithm that is powering this works differently, so you get a slightly different effect. Let me put gamma back to the default, which is actually 1, and turn the luminosity all the way down. So when I turn the luminosity all the way down, the image pretty uniformly looks darker. Let me put that back, and then I'll turn the gamma all the way down. And even though the image is darker, you still see more of the image. So gamma allows you to tweak the brightness and the darkness in a slightly different way. If I turn gamma all the way up, the image looks overexposed. Doesn't look very good. So for this one, I think I do want the gamma turned to the left a little bit. I'm going to do around 1.4. I think that'll look pretty good. So below gamma is temperature. Now temperature is how bright, how cold or how warm an image looks. If I turn it to the right, it'll look warmer. It'll look more red or orangish. Kind of looks like you're in a sandstorm on Mars or something. If I turn it down, if I turn the temperature down, it'll be colder. It'll be a lot more blue. The image I took actually is pretty blue to begin with, which you might have already noticed. So to compensate for that, I'm actually going to turn the temperature up a little bit to balance out that blue, so it looks a little more natural. So I think that looks good. Below temperature is a setting called saturation highlights, and this refers to the brighter areas of the image, which in this case is the sky. And it controls how much color saturation is in those highlights. If I turn this down, the sky will go to a grayscale. You won't have any color. If I turn this up, the colors will be more vibrant. So for this one, I am going to turn the saturation highlights up. But oftentimes I won't play with the saturation highlights. It just depends. Saturation shadows, similar to the highlights, it controls how much color saturation is in the darker areas of the image. Which, if I turn this down, we'll see that the shadows are this area to the left of the bulldozer where the treads are and this grass, also the grill and the front of the bulldozer. So by turning the saturation shadows down, the color has gone out of these areas. So I don't want the saturation shadows to be black and white, but I actually kind of like the saturation shadows turned down a little bit because my settings before for my shadows here on the mud and the grill looks kind of purple, so it's really picking up the colors from the sky, and I think it looks a little too saturated on the shadows. So I'm actually going to turn this down to around -4. It'll take some of the color out of the shadows, and I think make the picture look a little more realistic. Micro smoothing refers to how much contrast there is between each pixel and its surrounding pixels. If you turn it up, the image doesn't look as sharp. It also gets a little bit brighter. If I turn it down, the image gets darker, but it's also a little bit sharper. The default for this setting is 3. I'm going to turn it down a little bit
to 2, and I think that looks pretty good. Below micro smoothing is highlight smoothness. This is similar to the saturation highlight setting in that it targets the brighter areas of the image, but also is similar to the smoothness setting in that it smooths out the highlight some. So to turning that up, it kind of breaks up some, and you get some clipping of the colors, so that doesn't look good. I don't usually make huge changes with the sliders, typically. For this one, I think I'm just going to leave the highlight smoothness at 0 because that looks good. Shadow smoothness, again, determines how smooth the shadows are. If there's noise in the shadows, I can turn that up and it'll make the shadows smoother, but it also makes the image darker. In this case, I'm going to leave that at 0. Shadows clipping, almost never use this. If I turn it up, the darker areas, it looks like someone used the paint tool and just clicked around. Very abrupt, creates a very unnatural look, so I don't use that. Alright, well those are the settings I use. I think we're done. I think this photo looks good. I'm going to go to the lower right hand corner and click on Process. What this will do is take all the settings I've chosen, apply them to the photo, and then we'll be able to save it to my desktop. So here's the photo. I'm going to go ahead and click on File, and then Save As, and save this to my desktop as a TIFF file. Here's one of the 3 unedited, non-HDR photos. It looks like your standard image, and I think it's kind of boring. Here's the high dynamic range photo that was just created. You can see the vibrance and saturation of the colors, the visibility of both the sky and the foreground. I'm really happy with how this photo turned out. And this is why I do HDR photography, because you're able to get results like this.
You can follow this process yourself by downloading a free trial version of Photomatix over at hdrsoft.com. You can also download the 3 photos that I took to create this HDR image at my website, digitalblind.com/tutorial. Using those 3 photos in the trial version of Photomatix, you can recreate this process and follow along on your own. Now, the trial version of Photomatix does put a watermark on the images, so it's really only good for getting a feel for what the HDR process is like. If you do decide to purchase the full version of Photomatix, you can get a 15% discount by using the coupon code DigitalBlind. I hope you've enjoyed this video. For more of my photos, check out my website again at digitalblind.com.